You're watching Newsfeed. This is the PM edition. Thank you for staying with us. The Department of Trade and Industry and Competition has implemented a 6-month ban on the trade of scrap metal in South Africa. This in a bid to regulate and restrict damaging trade. According to the department, copper theft from the country's rail network and electricity grids cost the economy over 45 billion rand in the 2020-2021 financial year. Now joined by Stephen Hanival, Chief Economist, Department of Trade and Industry and Competition. Stephen, appreciate your time on this Saturday afternoon. Now just walk us through this plan, this ban. How will it impact the sector?
Good afternoon, Hugo, and thank you very much for inviting the department to be part of the show. So, Hugo, the ban is the initial first phase of what is a 3-phase process. And in this first phase, what we have asked Cabinet to approve is that we have a temporary 6-month prohibition on exports of waste and scrap metal, on copper. So copper in its entirety may not be exported if it's copper waste and scrap, and also ferrous metal. Now, there are a few exceptions for ferrous metals. For example, scrap metal that's produced in a manufacturing facility as an offcut, we believe that should be allowed to be exported. At the same time, what we've also included in phase 1 is a permit control mechanism for semi-finished products. These are products that broadly are the result of copper cable that's, for example, cut up, smelted, perhaps put into an ingot or something similar, and then there's an attempt to export it. For those products, we have a permit system that's going to be in place. And so we hope that companies that try to circumvent the ban will not be successful as a result of the permit process. And then the last element of phase 1 is import control on furnaces. For about 20,000 rand, you can import a small furnace which you can then use to melt down copper cable, and to then, in essence, disguise that copper cable so that the police can't recognize it. So that's the third element of what is the first phase of the program. And then we have a second and third phase where we're really intending to tighten the restrictions even further. In phase 3, we hope to be able to ban the use of cash for scrap, which we believe will also reduce the amount of illegal activity in the sector.
So is the cash for scrap the biggest contributor to what's been transpiring in the market?
It's certainly a contributing factor. I wouldn't say it's necessarily the biggest. I mean, I think the biggest is that, South Africa has quite an extensive public infrastructure network. If you add up all the railway lines, the telecom lines and the copper cable lines, we've got somewhere in the order of about 455,000 kilometers of cabling or railway lines. And so the biggest problem is that, the police simply can't protect all of that infrastructure with the limited resources that they have available. And of course, when we have load shedding, it's much easier for criminal syndicates to then steal copper cables. So I would say that's probably the primary challenge that the police face. We do in South Africa have somewhere in the order of about 70,000 scrap yards, metal recyclers. And again, the question that Cabinet needed to confront was, do we redirect SAPS resources into visiting each of those 70,000 scrap yards? Or do we say, let's try and limit the number of scrap yards that the police need to visit and spread the enforcement burden a little bit more widely across government departments? So, for example, SARS will be expected to check many more containers leaving the country to pick up where copper cable has been disguised or indeed actually actively mislabeled as something else.
So a couple of questions, Stephen. We obviously talk about syndicates, and one would imagine that if we're talking about syndicates, we're talking about a huge amount of power and certainly resource. Do you think that with this move that you have severed the serpent's head, firstly, and secondly, what sort of reaction do you expect from these syndicates? I'd imagine that they're not going to fold their arms and say, that's it guys, let's close shop, but they may come up with other means? Do you envision that they would still be in the process of buying copper and just storing it over the next 6 months, or do you expect a sudden change?
So what we do expect is that, like most other markets in South Africa, there's an element of supply and demand. And the demand at the moment for particularly copper, but also ferrous metals, those are your iron and steel metals, is primarily from overseas. There's a healthy domestic market as well, but certainly our analysis and the research that independent researchers have done for us suggests that the largest source of demand is actually global demand, because metal prices have been relatively strong for quite a while. So our thinking is that by implementing the temporary prohibition on exports, we are essentially cutting off a critical source of demand. At the same time, and particularly in phase 2 of the project and the implementation of the various measures, we're going to be introducing an input-output system that all scrapyards and recyclers trading in metal will have to comply with. And essentially what that means is that every scrapyard will be expected to show who had purchased copper from or ferrous metals, who that was then sold to, and what the data tools that we'll be using will begin to be able to help us with is to see where a scrapyard is, for example, buying in, let's say, a ton of copper a month, but is actually exporting or attempting to export 2 or 3 tons of copper per month. That's where the red flags are going to be raised, and that's where we would be guiding the police to say, look, here are some suspicious transactions. Of course, everyone is innocent until proven guilty, but these are a couple of scrapyards that we think you need to be undertaking some operations on. So we think that will play an important role in it as well. And maybe just to add one last element is that once the temporary prohibition is over, we are working very closely with our colleagues in the SA Revenue Services, with the idea being that, at the moment, Durban Port handles somewhere in the order of about 4.5 million containers of freight every year. Now, it's simply not feasible for SARS to open every single one of those containers and check that it's not copper cable that's been exported, or that it's not a ferrous metal that's been cut up into little pieces to disguise the fact that it's Transnet or PRASA railway lines. In the second phase of the project, we'll be requesting SARS to procure a number of container scanners, which will allow them to scan a much larger number of containers without needing to open every single container. So we think that we will be addressing both the demand and the supply side, and we really do hope that we will have fundamentally changed the, let's call it, the incentives for criminal syndicates to strip South Africa's public infrastructure.
Now, this 6-month ban, what impact is it likely to have on legitimate businesses, so those that aren't buying illicit copper and are law-abiding corporate citizens?
So, of course, there are going to be some impacts, and there are going to be some negative impacts. But I think the point that you made right at the start was the calculation is that the theft of copper cable alone, so that's not including ferrous metal theft, and of course, we've all seen what's happened to railway lines and train stations in South Africa over the last year or two. The cost just of copper cable theft is about 47 billion rand per year. That's a huge amount of money. And so what we put to Cabinet and what the independent researchers that we worked with developed was a scenario that said, can we afford to actually do nothing? What is the worst case scenario if government were to, in a sense, fold its arms and simply say, look, it's unfortunate, but we're not going to implement anything robust to deal with the problem. And the sheer magnitude of the damage done to the economy means that we couldn't, in good conscience, advise Cabinet not to do anything. So there are going to be some negative impact. We hope that some of them will be relatively short-lived. The 6-month export prohibition is a time-limited period. By the end of the 6 months, we will have the input-output reporting system in place, We'll have a range of other measures in place as well. And of course, for those scrapyards that are legitimate exporters, at the end of that 6-month period, they will find it very easy to get a registration certificate and a license, a buyer's and a seller's license to be able to trade in copper and ferrous waste.
Excellent.
But the 6-month...
Stephen, we're going to have to call time on this conversation. Certainly appreciate you taking the time this afternoon to speak to us. Stephen Hanival, Chief Economist at Department of Trade and Industry and Competition.